Everglades in the world. These are the opening words of Marjory Stoneman Douglas' prophetic book, The Everglades River of Grass.
I can remember my first visit when I was 4 years old to Florida. My family took me along on a trip. It was in 1890, you can't count back that far, I'm sure, but 1894, when I was 4 years old. We went by train with my parents to New Orleans. I know you know where New Orleans is. My earliest memory of Florida is one of being someone lifting me up, and I picked an orange off a tree. It smells so good. We were in the Tampa Bay Hotel. Now that's the hotel built by Henry Platt. And after 100 years, it's still there. Now it's a college. It has its same turrets and also some of its wonderful towers. Now when we got on the boat to go from Tampa to Cuba, to Havana, Cuba, the water was rough and I got seasick. Oh, they had to take me up and put me in bed in the stateroom. And I woke up finally when the waters were calm. Mother and Father had opened the door, and I saw this marvelous light coming through the door. It was a special white. It was a tropic light. I had not seen that kind of light before. I'd come from the north, where it was never that bright. I'll never forget it. It filled me with excitement and joy. Now, when we returned to Minnesota, Mother and Daddy started arguing loud and long. And one afternoon, I was playing on the porch, and the door opened, and my mother had a suitcase in one hand, and she got hold of my hand with the other, said, "Come on, we're going. We're leaving, Father." And we boarded a train. I was 6 years old. I didn't see my father for a long time. We went to her home in Massachusetts. Oh boy, was this house big. It had 3 stories. There was a place in the attic that I liked best. I could go and hide from the adults up there. There were so many grown-ups in that family, cousins and uncles and aunts and all that. They were always around, and so that was my place to escape. And I began to read. I loved reading and began finding out things. I could hardly wait to get to the 1st grade. No longer did I play with my dolls all day or go outside and play with kids. I wanted to know everything there was. They said I was intelligent. And although it was unusual for women to go to college in those days, Aunt Fanny insisted that I should go to college. After a joyful graduation, my cousin and Aunt Fanny took me aside and said, "We've been waiting to tell you this. Your mother's dying." She has cancer and it's metastasized, and she won't live very long. It was hours later that I was beside her bed, holding her hand. She was in so much pain. It was awful watching. She'd go in and out of comas. And finally, she died. Now I was lost. I didn't know what to do. So finally, I took a job in a department store in Newark, New Jersey. It wasn't a job for me. I wasn't fit for it. But there I met a man named Kenneth Douglas, a newspaper editor. Boy, he was tall and handsome and 30 years older than me. Now, he was the first man that ever paid attention to me. After 3 months, we were married. Now at last I had a friend, and I had company, and we went places together, but the marriage was very short. For in 3 months, he was arrested for passing bad checks and sent to jail for 6 months. I would wait for him, but I knew that my marriage would never be the same. Father heard about this. He was living down in Florida, and he said, wait a minute. I want you to come live with me and my new wife. If you stay there, you'll be in lots of trouble, for you will be an accomplice to the crimes that he will keep committing. And so, in 1915, when it was cold outside in New York in the fall, I boarded a train to Florida, to Miami. Ooh, was that a long trip. When we finally got to Jacksonville, all I could do was see passing by the window pine tree after pine tree after pine tree after pine tree, and I fell asleep when we pulled into Miami. But I heard someone say, "Good morning, Judge." And when I looked up coming down that aisle was my daddy, a judge. "Come on, darling." He said, took my suitcase, and off we went. Whew, Miami was a small town. The streets were still covered with white sand. 500 people lived there, and that's all. Why, you could be chased down the street by a panther or even have a close encounter with an alligator. Birds were all over the place. We got into a car that Daddy had rented, and we drove over the bridge to where his house was. And there his new wife came flying down the driveway with arms outspread and looked in pure delight in my face. And from that moment on, she was my best friend. She was from North Florida, and she was very smart and knew a lot about what had happened in Florida. Now, Father was the editor of the Miami Herald, and I soon became a part of that writing staff. Oh, my passion was writing, and now I could quickly use that passion. I began going to meetings and attending them, and people were concerned about the growth. The place was not growing right. They weren't taking care of the land. Why, it was heard that on the Everglades, on the very edge of the Everglades, they were draining and building houses there, and they were changing Everglades. Everglades? I'd never heard of that. But the people were worried. I never did get out there quite then, but because World War I came on, and everybody was joining the service. Even the women were allowed to join. They could be in the reserve, the Navy or the Army Reserve or the Red Cross. And I was assigned to go down to the dock to go and get a story about the very first woman who was going to be in the Navy Reserve and be sworn in that day. I got down there early because my father taught me, take notes, be sure what you're talking about, and don't make any mistakes. Ask questions, ask questions, ask questions. And I did, of the man who was there to interview and to swear in the people. Well, I listened to him carefully, and he kept saying they were desperate for workers. Imagine everybody's surprise, including my own, for right on that spot, I signed up as the first woman recruit in the state of Florida. It wasn't very long before I had to call my father to tell him what had happened. I got the interview, Dad. But the lady wasn't there. I'm the first recruit. Wait a minute, we're short-handed. Too bad. You have to stand up for some things in the world, and I'm going to serve. And off I went to France and Italy and Greece. And then when I finally returned to Miami, it was a different place. People, this time I was assistant editor, and people kept calling me and talking to me about a place called the Everglades. The Everglades. No place in the world like the Everglades. I became more and more interested in it. And every day, I would write more and more. I would ask people, I would interview them, and then I started going out to the Everglades. It was amazing. I saw alligators, snakes, birds of all kinds. And I noticed that the water was moving. It wasn't a swamp like everybody said. It was a river. But it wasn't a deep river, and it didn't move fast. And I realized if we didn't get in there and save that river, that South Florida would soon become a desert. The rest of my life was devoted to saving that river. And I became one of the great advocates. And I built a little house for myself in Coconut Grove. And it was there, in that house, that I began to write The Everglades, a River of Grass, my greatest story. It was published in 1947 when the Everglades became a park. Now, I was there when they came with President Truman to formally dedicate it. Before it could be dedicated, they had to vote on it in Congress. And my friend was afraid that they would not vote for this land to be preserved. There were too many people who had houses all along the way and had bought land. And so Ruth Bryan Owen went up and began to speak. She was the first woman congressman in the state of Florida about this place. But the people who had bought land there decided they were going to do something. In a great big bag, these homeowners had brought a snake. It was a big one. And they dumped it right out on the table in front of where they were going to take the vote. And it started to move. Now, Ruth Owen had never picked up a snake in her life, but she knew she had to do something desperate at that very moment. She picked up that snake, put it around her neck, and said, "That's how afraid we are of snakes in the Everglades." And they passed the park's motion. I've written a lot about the birds and the animals and the creatures in the Everglades, but it wasn't until after I was 82 that I took this on as a project and never stopped fighting for them. And when, at the end of my years, I will be buried, I've asked them to please scatter my remains over the Everglades. Don't forget the Everglades. It's your home and your beautiful wilderness. And I'm still resting there at 108.